From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis. We don't have to remind you about LaQaun McDonald or Jason Van Dyke or the 16 shots. You already know about them. But, you know, that wasn't really the original plan. You weren't supposed to know about them or to be able to read almost 250,000 complaints that private citizens have made about their encounters with the Chicago police. But thanks to a handful of deeply civic-minded people who, at great personal peril, have divulged important information, and thanks to a special breed of street-level journalists, things are beginning to change a little bit. Journalist Jamie Kalven and his associates have been putting together a stunning database of allegations of police misconduct in Chicago from 2016 all the way back into the 60s. And we're going to take a live tour of it today here on Chicago Newsroom. We'll also see firsthand what a couple of million data points can do when they start to connect with one another. Every pixel is a human story of police and public interaction. But first, we got to get caught up on some other news about the police department, including an update on the consent decree process and those upcoming trials of other officers accused of covering for Jason Van Dyke on the night that LaQaun McDonald was killed. So we've got a lot to cover on the program today, and I hope you will join me in welcoming to your device screens the Invisible Institute's Jamie Kalven. Welcome back, Jamie.
Good to be with you.
It's so great to have you back, and congratulations on so many things, but in particular the Citizens Police Database. It's an amazing accomplishment, legally as well as technically, and we will be talking about that. There are things that are sort of in the news and just slightly waning from the news right now that we probably should talk about a little bit. As you've said, the impact of the Jason Van Dyke trial is going to be with us for a long time. I was watching on CLTV every day, and I saw you sitting there in the second or third row taking notes. I guess the first thing I want to ask you is, do you feel that the trial, that the conclusion of the trial was a just one?
I do. I think justice was done, and a friend of mine, fellow journalist David Eads, who's at ProPublica, wrote me after the verdict and said, a drop of justice in an ocean of injustice. And I think that was sort of the sensation in the courtroom. I mean, it was quite an extraordinary moment when the jury rendered its verdict. Hushed courtroom, members of LaQaun McDonald's family, members of Jason Van Dyke's family, representatives of the Fraternal Order of Police, representatives of the activist community, and 12 of our fellow citizens render the verdict of second-degree murder. But then also, and this was what was most moving and compelling, there were 16 counts of aggravated battery with a firearm. So each of the 16 bullets that struck LaQaun McDonald was a crime. Yeah. And when the clerk of the court, an African-American woman, stood up and read the verdict, murder in the second degree, guilty, and then each of the 16 counts, it was really electrifying. And that, I wrote the first article about the case in February of 2015, so several months after the incident, and it was titled 16 Shots. Yeah. So the kind of arc across time from that first article based on the autopsy to this outcome is quite extraordinary. And I could never have imagined that this would have happened.
It's the reason that I wanted to ask you about that specifically, because there are really almost no other people who have this breadth of vision of the trial and of the circumstances. And I think it's worth maybe taking just a little bit of time to talk about that, because as I said earlier, the public was not supposed to know all the stuff that we know now. And you've spoken and written eloquently about the machinery of diversion, or whatever you want to call
Yeah.
it, of keeping the curtains closed. You have written about the three elements that opened this thing up. That there obviously was the autopsy. There's the eyewitness story, and then ultimately, of course, we get the video. And you were present, or you participated in the public revelation of all three of those things, and I think the public owes you a round of thanks for that.
Thank you.
But beyond that, let's just talk about how these things happen. To me, I think the most remarkable thing and dramatic thing is that at critical moments along the way, an individual stood up and said, "I can't keep this secret."
See, I think that's one of the important takeaways, and one thing that happens, I'm sure you've experienced this in the course of your career, when there's a kind of media frenzy around an event, as there was with the release of the video, and then again with the trial, you can sometimes lose the shape of the story.
Absolutely.
You know, you would think that investment of media resources would deepen understanding and clarify, but I think it can often have a different effect, and you kind of lose the shape of the narrative. And really, what's critical to the history of the LaQaun McDonald case, we can talk about the trial independently, but the incident, the public meaning of LaQaun McDonald in our civic life has to do first with what was revealed about, as you quoted me, the machinery. You know, I think of it as a machinery of, really the machinery by which Black lives disappear, and that's a machinery that had worked countless times before. They actually had every reason to expect it to work in this case. So I've often pushed back against the notion that there was a cover-up in any kind of narrow sense. You know, imagine Nixon and Haldeman, sort of Nixonian
It was
cover.
just a routine day.
It was, you know, I wish it were a cover-up. That would be easier to address, but it was standard operating procedure. This didn't require a conspiracy. This was the way the machinery worked. And for interesting and complicated reasons, in this instance, the machinery came to a clanging halt and collapsed. And it happened to happen on Mayor Emanuel's watch and Anita Alvarez's watch. But, you know, and that machinery continues. You know, that machinery continues. The sort of amazing thing about the kind of story of from beginning to end of revealing that machinery in this case is it depended on individual citizens, starting with, you know, I get much more credit than is due me because I never would have reported on this case were it not for a tip from somebody to this day I haven't named within law enforcement who reached out with the information that, you know, that shooting last week was not at all what was reported.
Yeah, there was
it was
more
horrific.
than
He disclosed that there was video and gave information that enabled me ultimately to find a civilian witness, a couple of civilian witnesses. So, you know, starting at that point, and then, you know, the civilian witnesses, Jose Torres, who again now his name is known, his son Xavier, you know, these were citizens just driving on Pulaski, stopped by the police action, had an unobstructed view of what happened, and he's the ultimate Good Samaritan. He you know, saw this, witnessed it, heard the reporting the next day, which didn't correspond at all to what he had seen, tossed and turned for the better part of a week, and then actually went to the Independent Police Review Authority, or since renamed agency that looks into police shootings. He went on his own initiative and gave a statement to this problematic agency that is sort of, you know, part of the machinery. So, you know, there's Jose and his son Xavier. There were several other civilian witnesses.
And they weren't welcoming with a brass band when they arrived.
You know, they obviously went through the motions, but, and I don't know all the details, you know, from that side of the story, but it's not as if, I think he felt like he was being steered to give a certain kind of statement. And then through various other successive, you know, people who stepped up and ultimately, and this for me was really moving at a time when our legal system at the federal level and the very rule of law is so precarious, is this case was judged by 12 of our fellow citizens in Cook County. And, so the trial as it was conducted under, the very intense authority of Judge Gaughan was actually really well managed. It could have gotten out of control in all sorts of different ways.
It did turn out that, some of that discipline was worth it.
I think it was actually, I was earlier in that courtroom under a subpoena that was where the defense was attempting to compel me to reveal sources. And, had a sense of the judge as being really, I don't know if temperamental is the right word, but so imperious and problematic. And in fact, I was in the courtroom for every minute of the trial, and I thought he handled it really, really well. So the legal system at the local level, at 26 in California, which is not a monument to, to justice, really acquitted itself well in this case. At the very moment that Kavanaugh was being put on the Supreme Court. But I think, and I think it's important to remember that the jury, a jury, largely white jury rendered this verdict. So it was an important moment, but I think it's important to distinguish in thinking about the trial between sort of the two dimensions of the LaQaun McDonald case. Once the video came out, the other revelations, it became it released an absolute implosion in our political life, changed the landscape forever, but it also became the framing narrative, the great public narrative to this day. And this is the LaQaun McDonald era.
And I think it's important that that you and your associates, for lack of a better way of putting them, of naming them, really made a significant impact, and I think that you're exactly right. The moment of the reading of the verdict, but the knowledge that it was a jury that was largely white, and all of these other kind of sensitivities that were popping up all through the thing, in the end, there was some kind of justice.
So this is justice.
Of course, we don't know what the sentencing is going to be. That's still to be determined.
Next week.
That's next week. But in any case, I do want to just dwell for one more moment on this, because you've referred to it as throwing wrenches into the machinery, and that there were the three wrenches. As I said, there was the eyewitness report at first, but then the autopsy, and I think you said something really significant about that LaQaun McDonald was unable to appear at the trial, but he did in a way. His body told the story to professional examiners, and they were able to piece together a great deal from that. But getting that autopsy was not easy.
Well, it's an interesting story, actually. It was in some ways remarkably easy, and I have to confirm this, but I think I'm the only journalist who ever asked for the autopsy, who ever sought the autopsy.
That's
which again
stunning.
Is such a common. I'm not 100% sure of that, and I made it public once I had it, so there was no need beyond that. But I actually, I've told this story before. My initial source. It takes some months for an autopsy to become finalized, so they're subject to a Freedom of Information Act request, and would have been late December, mid-December, and the incident had occurred October 20th. I reached out to Tony Preckwinkle, president of the Cook County Board, who's over the medical examiner, and I described what I knew about the case to her, and I asked if she would inquire of the medical examiner the substance of the autopsy, and that's
sort of a high-level FOIA.
Yes, high-level. Well, and a good friend to have in these circumstances. But the the prevailing story of what happened is aggressive young man with a knife lunges at police officer shoots in self-defense, in defense of his fellow officers.
And at this point, no one knows about 16.
No, but the sense was he was shot in the chest, died sometime later in a nearby hospital. That was the story. And I had found Jose Torres, who was horrified initially to find me on his doorstep, but as a person, because if I can find him, who else can?
Who
He's
else?
worried about he's worried about reprisals. A person of such personal decency that he couldn't not tell me what he had seen, and then we communicated a great deal in following that. So Tony Preckwinkle made an inquiry of the medical examiner, and we live close to each other on the south side, and I was actually going out for a run in the evening, cold December night, snow falling, and she drove up alongside me and beckoned me into her car, and
now this is where when they make the movie, this is going to be the scene.
As I recall it, she didn't even say hello. She immediately said 16 shots, front and back, and that was the first time I heard those words, and it continued to reverberate. And then, not too long after that, I was able to FOIA the autopsy, and for me, actually, as a reporter, partly because I
did she give you a copy of the autopsy report?
She didn't. But she told me 16 shots, and at that point I could begin to write.
So
I could begin to write the article that ultimately appeared.
So you had a confirmation, but you didn't have a document.
Yeah, and it was a week, 10 days later I got the document. And in truth, for me, and this was true in the trial as well, where the medical examiner spent 2 hours or more going through wound by wound, with photographs. For me, the autopsy was more personally powerful than the video, because the video for me was confirmation of what witnesses had told me. The witness testimony was powerful. The autopsy, as you say, an autopsy tells a story. An autopsy is a narrative, and that's the way they're written. They're really extraordinary documents, and this one was particularly so. As I think I said in the article that centered on the autopsy, this is as close, and it felt that way in the trial, this is as close as we'll ever come to having LaQaun McDonald testify about what happened to him, by way of these wounds. And interestingly, in the trial, the defense, the challenge for the defense, as you say, there are these three pillars of the narrative that have been established: credible eyewitness testimony, the autopsy, the video. The defense, the challenge for the defense was to create reasonable doubt on behalf of the client, Officer Van Dyke, by trying to destabilize people. So there, both with the autopsy and the video, all these efforts to dislodge what people could see with their plain eyes, which did not, it didn't succeed.
It didn't succeed, There are other people, other individuals too, but I think maybe we probably need to move on a little bit, although it is really important, I think, to talk about Will Calloway, right?
Sure. Oh, Will's been, So, and one thing that often I think gets misunderstood is that I didn't ask for didn't sue on behalf of the video, nor did anybody else. So once I published in February in Slate, every news organization in the city, national news organizations, sought the video, because I made known that it existed, and everybody sought the video.
It's, again, important milestone here. You write the sort of definitive piece in Slate long before anybody really understands that there's more to this story. So that's kind of that's almost, to me, that's kind of like the coming out is when that story appears.
And what's interesting about that moment is, I had the autopsy, I had the civilian witness, and I had knowledge that the video existed. So it's pretty much all there in that story in retrospect. But I wasn't in a position to tell what happened that night. What I was able to do definitively was to demonstrate that the police and the city's story of what happened simply could not be true. There was no way it could be true.
And it ends up being prophetic, because your Slate piece, to go back and reread it now from 15, right?
15,
15.
Early 15.
To go back all these years later and read it, and to see that it concludes by saying the city essentially has a couple of choices here. The mayor can just sort of release what he knows, or the mayor can try to hold it because there is an election coming up, and if he does, he'll do it at his own peril or something like that. And of course, we've seen what the last 3 years have brought in.
And I want to go back just briefly to Will's role, because it's an interesting part of the story. So the entire press corps is after the video.
Yeah.
But we all, including myself, accept the time-honored rationale that we can't give it to you because it's an open investigation. And we had won in 2014, and we'll come to that in connection with the Citizens Police Data Project. We had won a major FOIA case in which I was the plaintiff, Kalven versus Chicago, that established the closed investigations of police misconduct, shootings, and the like are public information. But this was an open investigation, and everybody
Closed meaning that they're over.
That they're over. They're and Will saw me, I think, interviewed by Carol Marine in April or May of that year, and became aware of the case, and did not even know what FOIA was, what the Freedom of Information Act was. And he said, out of inexperience, but also out of conviction, that I think dislodged some of the rest of us from our acceptance of city rationale, that that video should be public, somebody should. And so he and a young journalist, Brandon Smith, ultimately with support from lawyers who were part of the Kalven litigation, and pursued the video and denied their Freedom of Information Act request denied. They brought a suit, which ultimately led to the release of the video. And I think, even speaking for myself and some of the lawyers working on that, we had spent the better part of a decade getting to the Kalven decision. And I think our assumption was this was just part of the ongoing campaign and other engagement. We were used to the glacial pace of the legal process. And for reasons that are still somewhat complicated and mysterious, the things played out the way they did, and it was released. But absent Will and Brandon, and combination of naivete, inexperience, and principle, it wouldn't have happened.
Am I detecting, are you suggesting that the city didn't put up as vigorous a response as you thought they might have?
So what's mysterious about
Which would indicate to me that maybe they weren't that unhappy about releasing the video?
Well, I'm sure in retrospect they are. But I think they, so there are a couple of things that are really fascinating about that moment. One is that neither the state's attorney nor the U.S. attorney provided, in support of the city's position, an affidavit. They were the agencies that were actively investigating the case. As a formal legal matter, the FOIA request was addressed to, if I have my details right, the police department and IPRA, the Independent Police Review Authority, both of which had the video but weren't engaged in active investigation. They'd sort of stepped down in deference to the state's attorney.
Right.
And so, there was no showing of harm from the release of the video. And so what was going on between those different agencies is sort of fascinating. And then
these are the interesting details that go back to when you look back and you see how something historic that happened, often the little bits and pieces in the background.
That's what I'm doing now. I'm writing about it with that kind of all the ways in which this could have gone otherwise. So consider that everybody, the lawyers, journalists, we all left the court that day when the judge ruled that the video should be released, absolutely assuming that the city would appeal. And sort of run out the clock, and legal process is slow. It could have been another year. Hard to estimate what it could have been another year.
It was really more of a concept, saying, it must be released.
But think about but subject to appeal. Think of what could have happened in that year. Maybe, they get their ducks in a row, and either the state's attorney or the U.S. attorney brings charges. the videos released after charges are brought. Very different scenario, very different story if that happened. I mean, and they could even credibly say at that point, we said we would release it when the investigation is closed. The investigation is now closed, and we're releasing it. So why? I mean, I have had conversations with people high in the, in the mayor's office about why they released it, and I think it also surprised. It was the mayor's decision, and it surprised the other agencies. I don't think the U.S. attorney and state's attorney expected it. And they had to scramble. And I think
the mayor had just been reelected.
He'd just been reelected,
right.
But I
so
think
his dynamic was a little different.
A little different, but I think there also was the impression I've gotten from people I can't quote at the moment, but very close to it within the mayor's office, is they just recognized that the pressure had built to the point that it was uncontainable.
Yeah.
It was uncontainable. So it was more a political dynamic. It was young activists in the street.
Yeah.
It was the building, what ultimately became this kind of political firestorm.
So interesting.
And but I think the image that you went back to in the close of which is surprisingly prophetic now, the close of the Slate article was just my sense at that point, quite early in the process now, from where we are now, that the longer they withheld the thing, the more appalled people were going to be, not simply by the atrocity that's depicted in the video, but by the idea that the city had this, knew it, and withheld it from the public.
And this pressure cooker is just
and so
building.
and that's what ultimately blows the machinery apart.
So just so incredibly fascinating. Well, you know what? We brought you here. The main reason we asked you to come here today was to talk about this database.
Yeah.
So let's not get too.
So maybe
distracted.
the transition to that should just be to note that we're in a matter of weeks. There's going to be another trial.
Yeah.
And
well, there is
so,
that. Yes.
And I think it relates to the database in that what the Van Dyke trial was, despite the huge symbolic and public importance of the verdict, the trial itself was a completely narrow, stripped-down murder trial. All the larger issues about systemic conditions that allow for this kind of abuse and then hide it, all the questions about racial inequality built into our criminal justice system was excluded from the trial. This was a narrow, did individual X murder individual Y? And so through this very narrow channel, the process of the trial, we got a verdict which has huge symbolic implication. And I don't think if the verdict had gone sideways and you'd had an acquittal or a hung jury, I don't think the city would have erupted into riots, but people would, I think, have despaired of the possibility of meaningful change. And so, what happened in that trial, for all of its symbolic importance, is one officer was found guilty of a criminal act. The larger questions.
Well, 16 of them. But
16 of them.
17,
18 of them.
18 of them.
But the larger questions are the systemic questions. What set of conditions allow for these things to happen?
Right.
And then, as we said, the machinery kicks in to hide them from the public. So there is another trial of 3 officers. Some mystery again as to why it's only 3 officers. There were 11 officers who were the Inspector General did as a kind of proxy for the agency, for IPRA, did the administrative investigation and recommended that all 11 be fired, as I recall. Only 3 have been charged. Kind of interesting question. But in some ways, in terms of institutional change, the second trial, let's call it the conspiracy trial, is more important than the Van Dyke trial.
I agree.
Because it goes to what I and others often refer to as the code of silence, a culture that is less about silence than it is about kind of manufacturing these narratives.
This is an important point. As you say, only 3 people. We don't know why only those 3 people. But there's a sense that something is different I mean, as you said, if it hadn't played out this way, if these things hadn't happened, it wouldn't have played out. Could we even imagine that police officers would be brought to trial for writing fabricated reports about something that they quote unquote witnessed out there, which is after all the essence of what this trial is?
Well, and it's also, that goes to the larger machinery. And I think, in some ways, it's been extraordinary to have the LaQaun McDonald case be this kind of portal into these systems. But although police shootings happen too often, they're extraordinarily rare events. Officers fabricating narratives. One famous officer, famous for corruption and racist behavior, Jerry Finnegan, once referred to, kind of amusing from an author's point of view, referred to the power of the pen. That is this kind of
writing a
narrative
creative
machine.
report.
But so it's not just police shootings. I mean, every time there's a charge of resisting arrest, there's reason to suspect that there was excessive force on the part of police officers, and
there may have been 3 other officers.
And you need to cover, you need to cover up the apparent, the injuries to somebody. And so you charge them with resisting arrest or aggravated assault of a police officer. So, one of the things I felt as I sat in the courtroom, the Van Dyke courtroom, was here are all the press corps is there en masse, all of these resources, special prosecutor, kind of can't even really get my mind around how much this trial with all the pretrial stuff, cost the county. All of this directed towards impeaching one police lie. And we're sitting there at 26 in California, in Cook County Courthouse. And through the 3 weeks of the trial, and there's no reporter in any of those courtrooms, the machinery is groaning and grinding and doing damage to lives. And so nothing has yet fundamentally changed about the sort of creative writing that officers engage in, lying often about fundamental issues of fundamental questions of human rights.
What is your understanding of what this trial is going to be? What are these 3 men? I think they're all men, right? These 3. What are they charged with doing?
I haven't yet really dug into that. I mean, they're charged with conspiring, and it may be an obstruction of justice charge. I'm not sure quite how it's framed, but the content of it is that they willfully falsified reports of what happened, and that they in different degrees they coordinated that.
Is that a felony, or I mean, there are so many things about this that it's such new territory. I've never really quite put my head around whether it's a bad thing or not.
Yeah, I'm immersed in. I mean, it's critically important that they're charged, even though I apologize for not having command of the details more than I do, and it's critically important, even though they're it's only 3 and it's not going up the food chain.
Something happened there.
And there's also something that I should note that I find kind of poignant in it, that one of the 3 charged is an officer named Gaffney, who, the other 2, it's clear, there's a Detective March who really was central to the orchestration of the false reporting. Joseph Walsh, who was Van Dyke's partner that day, who was closest to the action to actually clearly see what happened, and who clearly lied about it. But then the 3rd is an officer named Gaffney, who was one of the 2 first responders. Who handled the situation, to my mind, flawlessly.
These are the people whose tire was punctured,
yeah,
right?
So
and they slowly folled him, and they were asking for a taser.
And they were patient. They didn't, when he refused to drop the knife, they didn't kind of escalate the encounter. There's nobody else around. They've got all the time in the world. They didn't ask for backup even. They just asked for a taser. And it wasn't clear that they would use it, but that would be the outer limits of the force that they would use. So then there's video from a surveillance camera on the Greater Chicago Food Depository, this huge building. So that you can see more than a block of movement. And it's an image of care. It's like they're accompanying this young man, keeping him from harm as well.
The question is, why him?
Why him? But I think what it illustrates, going back to the code of silence, and I think it's important that we have some sympathy for this. You know, often we sort of vilify police officers using the term the code of silence. They're lying, you know, to cover bad acts of one another. But think about it. There are 9 officers on the scene who witnessed an atrocity. I have no trouble, you know, imagining that they were as appalled as any of us would be, and more appalled on the scene.
Given that none of them had elected to pull his weapon and shoot.
None of them unholstered or shot. So they went, and particularly with Gaffney and his partner, who had spent, I don't know, more than 5 minutes, between 5 and 10 minutes, with the young man. Van Dyke gets out within 6 seconds, shoots. So they've witnessed an appalling event, and then they go back to the station house, and we'll find out more of these details in this trial, but presumably in some fashion the officers present are called into a room, and the conversation is not about what happened, it's about how we're collectively going to justify what happened. I can't imagine worse working conditions. You know,
I totally agree with that.
But the union completely refuses to acknowledge a code of silence. You know, if I'm a union rep and my membership is being subjected to working conditions like that, I would be, and I've had that conversation with Fraternal Order of Police leadership over the years, that we should be shoulder to shoulder, you know, talking about this as intolerable working conditions.
Which of course gets us back to the whole question of the consent decree and the FOP's just absolutely ironclad opposition to a consent decree. You know, these are all questions that are almost imponderable, I suppose. I can't leave the scene, though, without asking you about, I've wanted for months to ask you about the Burger King tape fiasco.
So
do you know anything about what really happened there?
Yeah, so we know that
there was tape, there was a surveillance system at the Burger King that could well have been facing into and given another perspective on the shooting, but it doesn't appear that it was working.
We know that a detective and a technician went into the Burger King.
There's video of them
commandeered. There's video. You know, commandeered the equipment. We know from the folks at Burger King who, you know, managed the equipment that it just, you know, it never broke down. It just sort of worked regularly, and I'm pretty clear that we know that some relevant minutes disappear from multiple cameras, you know, including the camera that looks at the French fries. You know, so. Apparently, and I need to corroborate this, but I have a source close to all this who says that there was a serious, I believe, FBI forensic analysis of the video and the video that did not find that it was tampered with.
So but that it just happened to go off for about that 1 hour.
I mean, I think the danger with these things, though, is, you know, that. So anyway, I mean, you know, that piece of the story has not been definitively established. What we do know is that all sorts of other things happened virtually immediately while the boy is on the ground bleeding out. You have police officers who are shooing away Jose Torres and his son and other so-called occurrence witnesses who've just seen a homicide. They don't interview them, they don't take contact information, they basically imply, get out of here or you're arrested. We know that 2 witnesses who were kind of didn't leave and said, I just saw an execution, were taken to a nearby police station, held for 3.5 hours, and subjected to a badgering interrogation where they were told, I mean, by police officers bearing down on them, you can't possibly have seen what you say you saw. We have video that contradicts it. They invoked the video that we've all now seen to say, we know that officers went back and collectively produced sort of mutually reinforcing reports supporting Van Dyke's story. And then up the food chain, we know that the press was stonewalled, that ultimately there was a settlement with the family conditioned on not releasing the video.
Right.
All of this, though, and I think this is why it's important to understand the machinery as a narrative machinery, a way of imposing, power imposes itself through narrative. All of that was in the service of a one-paragraph statement that was released that night under the superintendent's signature, released on the morning of October 21st, saying, young man with a knife lunges at police officer in self-defense, shoots and kills him. What ended up being required to maintain that false narrative proved to be ultimately catastrophic for the police department and the
unsustainable.
Unsustainable, but it had worked so many times before. So they didn't, I don't think, it's fairly late in the day where I think they realize that, oh my God, we've got, this explosive thing we're containing. I think in the early stages, it was just the machinery kicking in. Those officers who shooed people away didn't need to be told to do that.
Yeah, it's just
people
part of
knew
what
their
it-
sort of
right.
de facto
Everybody was
job
doing
description.
their job,
And the settlement, much has been made of the settlement and the idea that this was in the service of the mayor's re-election. I'm sure there were some anxieties about, they're trying to contain all sorts of things at that time. But, I'm not sure what the tab is now over the last 10, 12, 15 years. I suspect we're approaching $750 million in police settlements and awards. So that's just, again, ongoing.
Oh, I could go on. There's so many things I want to ask you about, but I think we should exercise some discipline of our own and explain to the people how this database works, because anybody with a device of any kind can go to, let's see what it is. It's Citizens Police Database.
Data Project.
CPDP.
Yeah,
that's right.
Just Google Citizens Police Data Project.
.co.
.co, yeah.
.co, and that'll get you there. But of course, you can Google it.
Yeah, but
once that happens,
so let me first just a little bit of background.
Okay.
So in 2014, March of 2014, the Illinois Appellate Court held in Kalven versus Chicago. It's really a watershed decision that documents bearing on allegations of police misconduct, hence police, investigations of police misconduct, are public information in Illinois. They belong to the public.
Let's say again when that was.
2014, March of 2014.
Okay. Well, but I thought we were going back to 2007, but yeah.
And it was the culmination of close to a decade of litigation. And I won't go into all the details.
Right.
There were a lot of interesting twists and turns in that.
Let's just note that this had been going on for about
a long
decade.
time. And it originally out of reporting that I did on the ground about, individual human rights abuses that led to a federal civil rights suit. So there are multiple chapters
you were based
of it.
at Stateway Gardens and public housing.
And so when the decision came down,
in 2014.
In 2014, we being the Invisible Institute, small journalism production company, were confronted with a kind of a pivotal moment, because the court said, this is public information. But they stated a principle of transparency, but that principle wasn't self-executing.
Yeah.
So for us, the question became, how do we operationalize transparency? To say, we have transparency, or it's like saying we're free because we have the First Amendment. We're only free to the extent that we exercise the First Amendment. And this is the same thing. So we now have put really significant resources of every sort, and certainly attention and creativity, into building what we call CPDP. as a tool for the public, for lawyers, for journalists, for researchers. And I can give you, some sense.
So this is what the front page.
So when
looks like.
when you land on the home page, this is what you see, and you see a heat map of the city. And it's important to note that the orangish, the darkest areas, those are.
We already know what that is because as I comment so often on this show, I've probably seen 500 maps of the city, heat maps, and they're all the same. And it doesn't matter what the issue is.
And that's what's so
they
fascinating.
all look like that.
Yeah, so this is where the complaints come from.
Right.
So the most intense parts are where the complaints come from. Won't surprise you, South Side, West Side. And, as you were saying, Ken, if you were to overlay this with other kinds of, so make it a layered map with socioeconomic information, with public health indices, with public education outcomes, with both, rates of violent crime and closure rates, the rates at which police are able to solve or fail to solve crime. Measures of abandonment, vacant lots, boarded up buildings, it would all align.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we want to convey is in some way, these phenomena are in plain sight, but we don't see them. So, all credit goes to my colleagues, what they've created is a way of housing, a sort of data infrastructure for housing information about the disciplinary history of Chicago police officers.
Now those numbers at the top there are, we should start at the beginning.
Yeah.
These are allegations that, again, the story is so immense to tell. How did you accumulate all of this data? Where did you get it?
So we, by virtue of litigation, the city was compelled to give us sort of the disciplinary profiles of officers. So a kind of timeline of complaints, the content of complaints, the ultimate disposition of the complaints. And also, I should say that the critical thing that we won in the lawsuit was the principle that the names of officers are public information. Because there's a long history of treating the identities of officers as private personnel file type information. And so the critical part of this and what makes the database so useful is we have the names of officers and we have the names of co-accused officers, other officers who, and that goes to what we're talking about with the narrative machinery, the officers who line up and provide mutually reinforcing statements, but also to see cohorts of officers who are so again and again, and when we say allegations and complaints, these are citizen complaints that are brought against particular officers for encounters that the citizens believe were abusive in one way or another.
So the top line that we see is 247,150 allegations, almost 250,000 allegations. An allegation is a citizen complaint?
Well, so a single complaint could contain, and sometimes they do, several allegations.
Okay,
so,
right.
he.
But that's what they are.
He
though.
beat me up, and he called me the N-word.
Yeah.
And those would be two separate.
But these are citizen complaints against the police department. Now, again, we will get to this.
Yeah,
there's all these issues.
But you said something really important early on, Ken, in your setup, which we're at pains to, and this is, I think, important as we enter the database, at pains to remind people of, is, we can do some very cool things with the aggregate data now. We can see patterns, and we can map people's, officers' social networks, and there's some very cool things that you can do. But it's critically important to remember that every data point is a human story.
Yeah.
So this is also, and it will become increasingly over time as we capture more and more of the underlying investigation documents and files. This is also a great human rights archive, a collection of stories of individual citizens who, against all odds, because it's such a deficient system, came to the state seeking redress of grievances and told their story. And we always want to, we're interested in doing the most advanced kind of analysis that can be done with the data, but always holding on to the human context. That these were and as many numbers as there are, as many complaints as are reflected in this, there are. We don't know the exact ratio, but the ratio of people who feel like they were abused by the police but don't complain, there's some estimates on the order of 10 to 1. So there's a huge ghost phenomena beyond the data.
Now, I have to ask one other question that's really critical here. As part of the whole consent decree thing and all this ongoing debate with the union, there's the issue about affidavits. That if you want to, as I understand it, if you want to file a complaint against a police officer, you have to be willing to sign an affidavit, right?
Which subjects you to possible perjury charges.
Right, because and it identifies your name and address and everything else. Are all 247,000 of those complaints that have affidavits filed on them?
Not all.
So you can complain without an affidavit?
The question is what you can complain. The question is what happens in terms of the investigative process.
All right.
So absent an affidavit, a robust investigation
that sounds like another show.
So it's another, but I think your reference to the union is important in this, and particularly with respect to the consent decree. This is a moment with the consent decree, which is going to be entered sometime next month probably, and the hearings are going on as we speak. Before Judge Dow, this is a big deal, and it's imperfect, and and all of that, but this is a blueprint that the city will be a blueprint for reform that the city will be committed to, that a federal judge will oversee. So there's real enforcement capacity. But there are a number of key provisions in it that are subject to the collective bargaining agreement of the police union and the city, which effectively gives FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police, a veto over reform.
Over the consent decree,
over reform,
right?
over elements of it. So this is a critical moment, I think, for public pressure to be brought to bear on the union. I mean, they've been, as you alluded to before, even compared to past years, they've been extraordinarily intransigent. And this is a moment for another quality of leadership on the part of the union. I mean, if the union would really come to the table in a constructive problem-solving way, it would immensely facilitate reform and better working conditions for officers.
Is it fair to say that when the union becomes intransigent in this way and fights for the rights of police who have frankly been abusive, that they're fighting for a minority at the expense of the majority?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the part that's so hard to understand.
So one thing I should be really clear about, and it's something that's often misinterpreted with our data, which is that the majority, very substantial majority of officers get between 0 and 4 complaints in the course of their careers. And if we scroll down here for a minute, just so you can see some of the officers.
Look at this.
So we mentioned Jerome Finnegan before, just to give you an example, and Finnegan has been imprisoned for some time. We'll get his.
There he is.
So here's his. So what really there are a lot of different ways of interrogating the database. You can look at your neighborhood, your police district. The most granular geographic unit is a police beat. So you can, people are interested in the policing of their area. But the primary architecture of it is officer profiles. So the information about particular officers. And in the case of Finnegan, who's been in prison for a long time, he's still, at or close to the top of the list of officers with the most complaints, the most allegations of abuse.
He has 175
175, but here is six sustained. And sustained means there was some finding that the complaint had merit. it doesn't mean, and then if you see under there, it's a little bit light, the print. In 2 instances was he disciplined.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, receive any meaningful discipline at all. So here below we have, a timeline of the different complaints over time.
That's remarkable.
As well as other information. We want these profiles to be rich. So if an officer received an award or a commendation, we want that to be known.
Now, I mean, it's not uncommon for even good officers to have complaints against them.
Completely,
That happens all the time. So you have to be careful and put this into some kind of
context. And we would
context.
never want to suggest, and that was the point I was starting to make. So most, and I don't have the exact statistics, I could get them for you, very substantial number of officers, preponderance of the force, have a handful of complaints, if any, in the course of their careers. Upwards of 90% or thereabouts have 10 or less complaints in the course of the years. And then you have individual officers and groups of officers working together who have extraordinarily high numbers of complaints. And it's the failure of the system to intervene at that point.
Yeah.
So we would never suggest that there's any kind of metric that an officer, this is a problematic officer because he's got 12 complaints or 20 complaints. What I think the data does indicate is you should take a look at that officer. If somebody had looked, so Officer Van Dyke, in a 5-year period, I believe, had upwards of 20 complaints, 10 of which were for excessive force, coupled with racial verbal abuse.
Yeah.
Somebody should have checked in to see what's going on with that officer.
Well, this is now
in his interest as well as that of citizens.
This is now a public utility. Anyone in the world can
This
look
is
this
a public
up.
utility.
I'm afraid we're down to our last 1 minute. Sorry to say, but there's a couple of points that must be made. The first is that the spirit of your journalism and your organizations and those with which you've been associated is an open access journalism, and it's something that I am so proud of. I admire you so much for it. Commercial journalism, if they get a FOIA and they get a piece of data, that's like they lock that in a safe because they're going to make money off of it. You put it out there for everyone.
But you know what was interesting about that is that was a matter of first principle for us. I mean, I intervened legally saying that, this belongs to the public, and when we said public, we meant public. So we, as a matter of first principle, if it were a strategy, as opposed to being proprietary about holding on to stuff and harvesting it for stories, as most legacy news are, it would have been a really smart strategy, because we now have so many collaborators diving. We have a hive of people working on it.
If they were all paying you for the...
Well, but they're producing good work.
Right,
so.
right. Jamie Kalven, thank you so much. We're cutting off in the middle of it. We've kind of like left a whole bunch of stuff on the table here, but that's all right. We'll do it again sometime, I hope.
Look forward to it.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thanks.
Jamie Kalven, what do we call you? The Invisible Institute. You have so many affiliations.
I'm executive, I'm a writer. Executive director.
A journalist, a true journalist.
Executive director.
Not a gas bag like me who sits here on TV and just, talks to people about the work they've done. Jamie Kalven, thank you very much. And we are running really late. We'll see you next week with another program. We're going to be talking about recycling next week and Lincoln Park, the history of Lincoln Park. So join us. Thanks a lot. Ken Davis, see you next week. Bye.